Hi, my name is Nick Best and welcome to the Astranti Guide to the dplc house building case study. This is the case study for the exams that are, it's called the September exam. It's actually at the end of August, and the November exam as well. This is the case study that's going to be used for those two exams. One thing for you to bear in mind just before we start going through the case itself is that this case study, this pre-scene, is background information about the company, of which then on the day of the exam you get the unseen information, which is a whole range of new information, and the exam is primarily on the unseen, with this pre-scene information simply being background, context. What you definitely don't want to do is use this and go into the exam and give all your ideas about this pre-scene and ignore the unseen, because it's the unseen on the day of the exam that is critical. So with that word of sort of starting and warning for you, let's take a look at this case. What we're going to do is we're going to work through page by page. As we go through, I'm going to do, well, about a page to 2 pages on each video, and we'll do one video, another video, and we're going to work it through section by section. As we go through, we're going to think about how each of the different elements of the case apply to the various different business strategy models. We'll have a look at whether they apply to Pestel analysis or 5 forces or Ransof's matrix, generic strategies, and so on. We'll try and produce some information that will go into a SWOT analysis, and we'll discuss and debate the different options, the different issues for this company. Our aim is to do a complete strategic analysis of this business. When we get to the end of this video series, then we'll actually go through each of those models. Our final video is to go through each of the different models and see how the strategic analysis applies to this company and come up with our view of how we feel this business should be taken forward. And then we can use that as context when we go into the exam. So it's all about understanding the case, getting information about this case, and really getting to grips with it and understanding what it means for the exam. As I'm going through, I'll also be giving you little thoughts and comments on the exam itself, and so I'll just build those in as those occur to me as we work this through. Okay, so I'm going to start off then in this first video by going through up to this section, structure of the industry, which is on page 3. And I think I'm going to start off down here. Okay, this industry itself is the house building industry. Our company D House Builders is a UK based house builders, so we can see dplc house builders, and they're based in the UK. But most of this first section, in fact over the next few pages, is background information. And if you remember from your strategic analysis, when we're not talking about the company but we're talking about the business environment, we are typically looking at the opportunities and threats in the SWOT analysis, not the strengths and weaknesses, because that would be specific to a particular company. We're also looking at some of the business environment models, such as Pestel analysis, the 5 forces analysis, Ransof's matrix, to look at different markets and product options, and so on. So it's very much those broad environmental models that are going to be the key focus for this section, and actually the next few sections until we start to learn about D itself. My assumption as we go through these videos is that you haven't read the rest of the case. And so I'm not going to be introducing too much to you about dplc, for instance, until we find out a little bit about dplc. We'll take it page by page as if this is the first read that you've had through. So that's the way we're going to work this through. Okay. But we can't get away from, if we look at these characteristics of the house building industry, we just can't move away from the current global situation. And at the bottom of the of this section here, it talks about the global financial crisis in 2007 and from 2007. Now, up until that point, worldwide, the house building industry had been in a strong boom situation. House prices, well, virtually throughout the world had been going up, often at double-digit percentages each year. Market prices were very high. There was huge amounts of finance that was being made available to buyers to get mortgages. And of course, as it actually sort of states in this section, this is actually what brought about the global financial crisis. It all started in America, where loans were being given out to people who simply couldn't afford to pay them back. As soon as those loans got started to materialize, people couldn't actually pay them back, or the actual loans had been sold on to lots of other banks around the world, and gradually more and more banks realized that there was going to be all these loans which they couldn't pay the money back, and that started off the crisis, which here we are in 2012, and we are still really, I suppose, still right in the midst of it, with all the problems here in Europe. I mean, America's starting to recover a little bit, but even growth there is very slow. There was a report very recently on the US housing market that said that there was some signs of recovery in terms of prices, but certainly in European markets there have been great difficulties over recent years. And I've got some figures for you on different markets that I'll share with you in just a few moments' time. So up until 2007, huge boom situation. But since then, it's been a very difficult time for the housing market. As it particularly says down here, it's been a particularly bad time, mostly because the banks are nervous about lending to the house buyers. Banks have had a difficult time of it, and not that we particularly feel sorry for them, but of course they've been lots of money on bad debts from before, and the reputations have been bad. They're not wanting to take any risks in this instance, and therefore then we have got the people that can afford houses in Western economies largely being confined to people that are better off. They've got the deposits to put down on their houses. The banks will lend to those people who are in a worse financial situation. Not so good. So what can we conclude about this then, if we start to look at some of our strategy models? Well, we could say therefore that puts those fewer buyers, it gives them more power. That is, buyer power importers by forces. And of course, because of that buyer power, they're able to negotiate lower prices. And what this means then is that builders and building companies have been competing against each other in order to sell their stock, their housing stock, for where there are fewer buyers in the marketplace. This has meant that prices have been kept down. If we're looking worldwide, then most of the European and US markets, prices have, in many markets have actually been falling. In the UK, it's been falling a little bit, but really quite stagnating price wise. The number of sales has gone down. Prices are very much zero, not growing very much effectively. So not a good time for housing companies with that increasing amounts of buyer power. Okay, let's move on then next to just have a look at this little section up here. Moving on to something slightly different, we've got the comments on one of the restrictions on this particular industry, and that's land for house building is generally in short supply. Now, from a model point of view, we'll be looking at the Pestel analysis. Particularly, we're looking at political and legal issues when it comes to the availability of land, and particularly the making available of land. Then it goes on in the next section to talk about it very much depends on the state and the systems of the state in terms of what the regulation is, in terms of releasing land for building, in terms of we'll move on to legal things such as planning permission on certain types of homes in certain locations according to certain designs, and it's a restriction. It's a restriction on this particular marketplace. We can also comment on here that land for a building company is basically a supply, and so there may well be supplier power amongst people that own that land, particularly if that land is in a good location. It's highly likely that building companies are going to want the few bits of land that are in good locations, and therefore the suppliers are able, or really the owners of that land, are able to sell that land for more. So we've got supply power in there as well. One final thing in this, this second paragraph under the heading of state is, of course, although we're a UK building company in dplc, it does talk about, and quite a lot of the next few sections talk about developing countries, and regulation maybe not quite so high in developing countries. And in actual fact, for basically a UK-based business, overseas building may well be a significant opportunity in the SWOT analysis. In Ansof's matrix, this will be a new market for an existing product, assuming they'd largely be doing the same type of housing in those new markets. If there's less regulation, what that means is that there's more of an ability to probably acquire land, there's a wider availability of land, the building regulations themselves might not be as strong, that may enable them to keep costs low, and therefore that may enable increasing profitability. In Western markets where you've got high supplier power, high buyer power at the moment, therefore profitabilities are squeezed and it makes the market far, far more difficult. And as we'll see in a moment, I'm just going to go through with you in a moment some of the profitabilities of some of the UK house builders, and in current times they are really finding it hard. It's a real struggle, and we can see this by applying some of our business strategy models, which is of course what we have to do for the exam. Okay, so next point that I want to raise is sort of taking this forward a little bit, this idea of the overseas market. The next paragraph tells us a little bit about the advent of global television coverage has led to some convergence in tastes, which means that Western star houses have expanded into really different affluent suburbs and cities around the world. That's basically more of this. It's more commentary on there's a big opportunity for a company to expand overseas, and so again, this is the O in the SWOT analysis coming in there as well. Let's just put in opportunity. So what are the markets that are growing? What are the sort of big opportune markets for a housing company? Let's just go where we've got a little bit of space down the bottom here. And let's have a look at some of the growth statistics. So according to globalproperty.com, who do analysis of different worldwide markets, then in the last year, the Brazilian market, this was particularly in Sao Paulo, one location, but gives you a good indication of the expansion possibilities there. Prices rose by 19%. In India, prices have risen in the last year by 24%. That was in Delhi. And so we've got two of the BRIC countries, Russia and China being the other two. China's a much harder market to go into because of the regulation in those markets. Again, we've got the political, if we go back up here, we've got the political and the state and the way they control it. China's a hard market to go into. Russia was much lower growth. I think it was about 3 or 4%. Of course, Russia was very, very fast property growth during the boom years of Europe and the US of 2002 through to 2007. So there wasn't as far for the property market there to grow in terms of prices, but huge growth in terms of market prices in Brazil and India. And let's just contrast that then against a couple of the economies that we know haven't been very good. One of those in Europe is Ireland. In the last year, Irish property prices have fallen by 19%. Imagine being a house builder based in Ireland. Now the profit margins are so much smaller. In fact, can you even build profitably? Would you even want to build when there's been so much building going on and there's excess supply in these markets? Is another issue. Another one that I suppose is not a surprise that the market would have fallen is in Greece. There was a 12% fall last year in property prices in Athens. And so what we're seeing then is that property market, we've got these big growth markets such as Brazil and India. We're contrasting that against some of the European markets such as Greece and Ireland. And we can see, yes, there's opportunities in some markets. There's some markets we definitely wouldn't want to expand into. With the UK market very much stagnating, then this is definitely something for a UK-based house builder to consider. And all of this is just hints from the examiner that, oh, there's an issue here. There's a big opportunity, something that we can go forward and take. These kind of comments, as you go through and look more and more at the pre-scene, these kind of comments as we go through, they're giving you ideas for new unseen issues that can come up. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some unseen about an expansion into some overseas market, what the advantages and disadvantages of those are. And we're given some more clues here, in fact, as we go through. So we can see then that, okay, Western style houses are relatively popular in some of these markets. It says in this little section here, hence the opportunity that I wrote just there. That's good. We don't have to change our designs too much, although there would be some change in design, of course, based on local weather conditions and cultural norms and so on, but probably not as much as you might have to do. Another thing to consider is in some countries the houses are built primarily to rent. Now what that means is if we are buying and building to sell, those markets are less good markets to go into. An example of that would be Germany, for instance. In Germany there's a much bigger rental market than there would be in many other countries. So we want to look for a market where people are perhaps can afford to and are wanting to own their own property if we were expanding outside. Okay, and one final point just out of this section is this idea that one of the limitations is the prevailing market price. And like all markets, the property market has got supply and demand acting upon it. There's been less house building over the last few years, and so demand has gradually been going down, which is a good thing, which means that prices may recover over the medium term. Demand will go up as the economies around Europe and the world recover, and we can see in countries like India and Brazil, where there's been little supply in the past but big growing economies now, actually the prices have been going up significantly. But the one key restriction here then is that will have a big impact on profit margins. It's not like some industries where you can basically say, well, it's cost us a certain amount to build a product and then we'll put on our normal profit margin of 30%. Well, there's very much a market price. What is the market price of that rather than what's the amount that we're going to put on top? And so if that market price stagnates or even falls, then we see our profit margins being tightly squeezed. And that's been a big issue for building companies just over the last few years. Prices have either been falling or stagnating. In fact, inflation has been reasonably high, particularly on building materials, which means the profit margins have been squeezed. And so, therefore, that is something for us to consider when we come to look at the UK housing industry. Who are the main players in this marketplace, and what are their main positions in terms of turnover and particularly in terms of profitability? Let's have a look at the top three in the UK market, just to start us off on the structure of the industry in the UK. So the biggest in the UK is Taylor Wimpey, and they had a turnover of £2,603 million in 2010, I believe that was. It might have been 2011. They're actually 2011 comparisons. And based on that turnover, there was a 700 million loss. And so we can immediately see that very big company, huge turnover, but loss-making in current conditions. And of course that reflects everything we've been talking about the market as a whole. Let's have a look at our second biggest player then. Second biggest player in the UK is Barratt, and Barratt's turnover is not dissimilar from Taylor Wimpey's 2030. 5 million with a 679 million loss again. So two companies in very, very difficult situations because of the squeeze of margins, the reduced market prices, the higher prices of materials and so on. They're finding it very, very difficult in current conditions. The third biggest in the UK is probably the one that is most like D in terms of the financial performance. We'll have a look at the financial performance later on, but these figures are very, very similar, with a turnover of 1,569 million and a profit, quite remarkably, of 78 million. And so, as you come and do your industry research, what will be interesting for you to find out is, well, why is it they've been able to be profitable, whereas Taylor, Wimpey and Barrett have been loss-making? What have they done to turn things around? Is it the nature of the products they're doing, the markets they're in? And of course, as we go through our case study, we'll be having a look at dplc, and we'll have a look at their position. What's enabled them to stay in profit? Whereas in actual fact, if you look down the top 20 house builders in the UK, you see that well over half of them are loss-making, and those that are profit-making are only making very, very small profits. So what does this mean then? One thing for us to bear in mind here then is that we have some of these very significant large companies operating nationally in the UK. There are also other competitors, smaller competitors, but over recent years, it tells us here that there's been lots of mergers and consolidations between some of the smaller ones, and has created a number of large companies. Those large companies, therefore, will be, particularly in these difficult conditions, will be competing very heavily. And of course, not only will they be competing against other building companies or new property, of course, you've got all the existing property, which is might be argued to be being perhaps a substitute in this industry, which people can also use to live in as well. And so therefore, this is why we have to take the market price, whatever that market price will be. But it also means that these companies will be competing over deals and loan agreements and ways to attract people into their property and to buy their particular properties. Okay, so it's a very competitive market with some very powerful competitors, which also makes it difficult in these difficult times. It does mention down the bottom here more of this idea that there are some of the competitors in the market that have been willing to consider building outside of the UK. Definitely what you should do is to look and find 2 or 3 of those examples, because those would be brilliant examples to give in your case. While we're talking about that, what you must do is go away and quote industry examples. In actual fact, just from this page that I've given you here, you could get a fantastic industry example to include in your introduction. You could talk about the Taylor Wimpey, the Barrett and the Permison turnovers and profits, how difficult the market is, given some of the environmental information, and that will get you a mark. That type of mark is a diversity mark in the exam. Your aim is to get 5 industry examples into your script, 1 in the introduction, 4 elsewhere, and by doing that you will get a mark for each of those industry examples. Give the industry example and then relate that industry example to the scenario, particularly the unseen, and say why it's relevant to that unseen. Okay, so you've got one on that page actually that you can start off with, perhaps include as your introduction as well. Okay. Right, the next paragraph just gives us a little bit more generally information about these large companies being publicly quoted. Of course, if you are publicly quoted, you then listed on the stock market, you'd have to abide by the corporate governance regulations in the UK. That would be the combined code of corporate governance and so on. So the various restrictions of being publicly quoted companies come in there. Okay, so there is our first video. That's our introduction to the first page and a half. A lot of information there, a lot of broad information about the market, particularly about overseas markets and opportunities, a little bit of information on the UK industry to get us started. In our next video, we'll move on and have a look at more information on the UK markets, and I shall see you shortly in that